The tomb of Qin Shi Huang has been sealed since 210 BC, and the one thing keeping everyone out is leaking. Around 100 tons of liquid mercury are still lying under that mound. That figure isn't folklore, it's an estimate built from soil chemistry and from mercury vapor measured in the open air above the site. A burial chamber that poisons anything that walks in and quietly announces itself to instruments on the surface. Nobody has been inside. No camera, no probe, no survey from within. 2,000 years on, that door is still shut. You can see it from the plane window on the way into Qian, an earthen pyramid with the top flattened off, sitting in farmland east of the city, planted over with trees, big enough to read as a hill rather than a building. Han Dynasty records put its original height at something close to 100 meters. 2,000 years of rain have worn that down, and it still owns the plane. A mile and a half away, tourists arrive by the busload, file into a hangar, photograph the terracotta warriors, and get back on the bus. Almost none of them realize the emperor is behind them, under the hill. The whole site turned up by accident. In March 1974, farmers in a village outside Qian were digging a well during a drought and hit something hard-fired clay, a life-size head staring back at them. Bronze arrowheads still sharp enough to use. They had punched straight into pit 1. Excavation eventually produced something like 7,000 terracotta figures, infantry, archers, horses, chariots, every face modeled differently, every one of them facing east, toward the states this emperor had conquered. It became one of the most famous finds in archaeology. And here's the part people skip. That army is not the tomb. The warriors are only the outer guard. They stand well beyond the walls of the burial complex, like a garrison posted at the perimeter of a city. By 2008, surveys had mapped more than 600 pits and features scattered across the necropolis bronze waterfowl, arranged along an artificial stream, stables, acrobats, armor cut from stone, an entire civil service for the dead. 50 years in, the archaeologists working that outer ring are nowhere near finished. And the center, the chamber holding the man himself, has never been entered. Everything anybody claims about the inside of that room comes from a single book. That book is the Shiji, the Records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian roughly a century after the emperor died. Sima Qian was a court archivist with access to state records, and he writes about the tomb in flat administrative language like a man reading off a work order. Construction began in 246 BC, when the future emperor took the throne of Qian at 13 years old. It ran for close to 4 decades. The workforce, he says, reached 700,000 conscripted laborers. That isn't a battle. That's a public works project, the size of a small nation, aimed at one room. Then Sima Qian describes what they built down there, and the register changes. Palaces and scenic towers for 100 officials. Rare artifacts and wonderful treasure, carried in and stacked. The ceiling set with the heavenly bodies, the constellations mapped overhead. The floor laid out as the geography of the empire below. A working model of the world this man had just finished conquering, buried under a hill so he could carry on ruling it after death. And that is the tame part of the description. The next line is the one nobody could take seriously for 2,000 years. Mercury, he writes, was used to simulate the 100 rivers, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the Great Sea, and it was made to flow mechanically. Liquid metal pushed through channels cut into a scale map of China in a chamber nobody was ever meant to see. Read that as an engineer instead of a poet, and it stops being decoration. Mercury evaporates slowly, supports no life, and poisons anything that tries to live near it. A sealed room with mercury running through it isn't scenery. It's a preservative and a weapon at the same time, and it never needs maintenance. The weapons are explicit. Sima Qian records craftsmen installing crossbows and arrows primed to shoot at anyone entering the tomb, a triggered defense, loaded and abandoned. He also describes lamps fueled with animal fat, lit so that in theory they would burn forever. Whether any of that still functions after 22 centuries is a genuinely open question. But the bronze crossbow triggers pulled out of the warrior pits are precision-made and interchangeable, machined to a standard Europe wouldn't match for a very long time. Qin engineers were entirely capable of building a mechanism, arming it, and walking away. The men who built the mechanisms were sealed inside with them. That's the line that tells you what kind of operation this really was. When the burial was finished, the middle gate was shut and the outer gate lowered, and nobody who knew the layout came back out. The second emperor also ordered the childless women of the harem to follow his father into the ground, so the tomb was designed by people who were never permitted to describe it. Every schematic, every trap placement, every route through those chambers died behind that door on purpose. For most of recorded history, scholars filed all of this under literary flourish. Sima Qian was writing under the next dynasty about a regime everyone had a political interest in painting as monstrous. Rivers of Mercury sounds exactly like the sort of detail you invent to make a tyrant sound like a tyrant. Chinese historiography carried the passage for 2,000 years in roughly the same drawer as dragons and immortality pills. That was the settled reading right up until the 1980s. And then somebody stopped arguing about the text and went and tested the dirt. Researchers from China's Institute of Geophysical and Geochemical Exploration ran soil samples across the mound, and what came back was a mercury anomaly. Concentrations far above the regional background, reported as high as roughly 2,200 parts per billion, in places dozens of times what the surrounding farmland carries. And here's the detail that matters. It wasn't smeared evenly across the hill the way industrial pollution or a natural mineral seam would be. It clustered. Hot spots sitting over the middle of the mound, exactly where a burial chamber would be if the historian had been telling the truth. The picture sharpened in 2003. A national high-technology program put hyperspectral remote sensing and geophysical survey over the site, with Duan Qingbo of the mausoleum's archaeological team leading the work. They traced a thick rammed earth wall ringing the burial chamber under the mound palace walls, standing something like 30 meters high, entirely underground. The chamber they outlined runs on the order of 80 meters by 50. And they did not find the thing half the world expected. No major collapse, no obvious ancient robber tunnel reaching the center. As far as the instruments can tell, it is intact down there. Then, in the summer of 2016, a team pointed a laser at the air above the mound. The method is differential absorption LiDAR fire ultraviolet light at a wavelength mercury vapor absorbs and read what comes back. The results, published in scientific reports, found localized concentrations well above background, peaking around 27 nanograms per cubic meter. And the hotspots in the air lined up with the hotspots in the soil. That's the whole ballgame. Mercury isn't just sitting in the ground under that hill. It is leaking out of it into the open sky right now. The same team put a number on the leak. Their estimate is that roughly a ton of mercury has worked its way out of that hill over 22 centuries, and that, they reckon, is about 1% of what originally went in, which leaves something in the neighborhood of 100 tons of liquid mercury still down there, still sealed, still doing whatever it has been doing since 210 BC. Anybody who wants to open that door has to plan on walking into a poisoned room. And that 100-ton figure raises a question that bothered chemists for years. Where do you get 100 tons of mercury in the 3rd century BC? You don't mine it as a liquid. You mine cinnabar, the red ore, roast it in furnaces, condense the vapor, and repeat, thousands upon thousands of times. Research published in early 2025 traced the chemical signature toward the cinnabar mining district around Xunyang in southern Shaanxi, a region with a long history of mining and smelting. So picture that supply chain. Mountain mines, furnace crews, and sealed vessels of liquid metal hauled hundreds of kilometers north for a room the client intended nobody to enter. The terracotta warriors were painted. That's the quieter reason the door stays shut, and it has nothing to do with the poison. More than 10 pigments have been identified: vermilion, sky blue, a purple that arguably shouldn't exist that early. You have never seen those colors because the clay was sealed with a raw lacquer underlayer first. Exposed to dry air, that lacquer starts curling within about 15 seconds and flakes away in roughly 4 minutes, carrying the paint off with it. The gray army in every photograph you've ever seen is not what was buried, it's what we did to it by looking. And China has already run this experiment on an emperor. In 1956, a group of prominent scholars, Guo Moruo and Wu Han among them, pushed to open the Ming tombs north of Beijing. Their first target was Changling, the tomb of the Yongle emperor. Archaeologists talked them down from it, and a smaller tomb was picked as a rehearsal: Dingling, where the Wanli emperor had been buried in 1620. They found it completely intact. Sealed chambers, the emperor and 2 empresses, thousands of objects, porcelain, worked wood, gold, and bolt after bolt of imperial silk. Nobody in 1956 knew how to keep any of it. The silk came out of a stable, sealed environment into open air and began destroying itself. Several attempted treatments made it worse. The textiles ended up stacked in a storeroom that leaked water. 10 years later, during the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards dragged the remains of the Wanli emperor and his 2 empresses out in front of the tomb, denounced them, and burned them. The coffins were destroyed as well. A dig staged as a rehearsal became the most expensive lesson in the history of Chinese archaeology, and it changed the rules. Archaeologists petitioned Zhou Enlai directly, and the ruling came down: no further excavation of imperial tombs. Not then. Not until the field was genuinely ready. That position has now held for about 70 years. When the intact entrance to the Qianling mausoleum turned up, it was documented, photographed, and left alone. And Duan Qingbo, who led work at the Qin site for a decade, has stated the current position plainly: there is no plan to open the chambers because there are no mature technologies and no effective measures to protect what's inside once air gets to it. So that's the decision I promised you at the start. It wasn't made at the first emperor's tomb at all. It was made in 1956 in a leaking storeroom full of ruined silk, and it has been binding on every emperor's tomb in China ever since. The workaround now is to look without touching. Physicists have simulated imaging the underground palace with muon's cosmic ray particles that rain through solid rock every second of every day, and recent reconstruction work has been refining the algorithms needed to turn that into a 3-dimensional picture. Detectors in the ground, no shovel, no door. Which leaves us here, a chamber roughly 80 meters across, around 100 tons of liquid mercury, a 2,000-year-old map of a world that no longer exists, and a leak you can measure from the surface with a laser. We know it's there. We know almost exactly where. And the entire apparatus of modern science has looked at that and concluded the right move is to leave the man alone and hand the problem to a generation with better tools. So tell me what you would do. If the technology arrives in your lifetime, should anyone open that door, or has it earned the right to stay shut? That's the story. If you'd watch one more like this, hit subscribe, and I'll have another ready soon.